happy to welcome you here at our public lecture, which is a part of our international workshop about incorporating sexual violence into Czech World War II history. Why we are all here, that has also kind of history. So when I was writing my dissertation or thesis about collective violence in Bohemian lands at the end of the Second World War, I found a lot of interesting cases of sexual violence or sexual abuse, but what I didn't find was the literature about that in Czech historiography. And I found that as a problem, and I met then Anna Hajková at a lecture here in Prague, and they started to talk about that, and then we decided to organize a workshop to open a totally new field in the Czech historiography. So it's kind of a special event today that we can open a totally new discussion in the Czech historiography about sexual violence. And that's also why we invited Regina Milhojza. And that's it. So we are here, and I'm very happy to have you here all. So enjoy the lecture.
I'm Anna Hajková of the University of Warwick, and it is my pleasure to organize this workshop together with Jaromenka. And it is my job, I will get out of sight so that everybody can see Dr. Milhojza, to introduce Dr. Regina Milhojza, who is a senior researcher at the Hamburg Foundation for the Advancement of Research on Culture, and also associate researcher at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research in Germany. Many of you will know this institute as the German acronym, the HIS. Regina has studied history, Korean studies at modern German literature, and worked at the concentration camp site at Memorial in Neuengamme. Regina has not only been working on sexual violence during the Holocaust, she has also started, and to this day has been working on the plight of the so-called comfort women of occupied Korea during the Second World War, and she even speaks Korean. But she's here today because she's one of the foremost experts on history of sexual violence. She co-founded the international research group Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict, and she's co-coordinator at the Hamburg-based working group War and Gender. And in particular, her book, do you have it, Jaro, by any chance with you? Okay. In English, Conquest, Sexual Violence and Intimate Relations of German Soldiers in the Soviet Union, which in German came out as Eroberungen, sexuelle Gewalttaten und intime Beziehungen deutscher Soldaten in der Sowjetunion 41 bis 45, has set standards that makes her, in my opinion, the single most important scholar on sexual violence in the Second World War. The book has been translated into Japanese and is forthcoming in English, and Jaro and I are hopeful that we will bring about that the book will come out in English as well. We are thrilled and privileged to welcome Dr. Milhojza to Prague. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. It's a little bit problematic because I cannot see the ones on that side. Anna, you have to move in that direction.
You don't need to see me, I'm old to you.
Okay, then that's okay. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much to both of you and the Institute for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and to have the chance to get into conversation with you. From my work at the interdisciplinary research group Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict, we meet once a year interdisciplinary scholars, researchers, and also NGO practitioners, and every time have a certain subject, one question, and then compare from our empirical studies, from our empirical knowledge, compare how we approach these questions, what methodology we can use, how we can gain a better understanding of this form of violence. And I've learned from this group how important it is really to get into the debate about different ideas, about different situations, about different knowledges, and really discuss what we know and actually what we don't know. So I hope we have the chance to do this today. And this morning I will present some experiences and results of my research. And since we want to take this day to explore how we can understand sexual violence in history, I have decided not to hold a classical historical, typical lecture comparing the German and the Japanese army and the Allied forces. I can do that at another point, but I think this is not what we want to do today. I will rather take up some of my general observations, which might be, I hope, useful for our discussion on the historical occurrence of this form of violence. So let me start with the quote of the title of today's event, "My plight is not unique." So this is a quote coined by Judith Maria Isaacson. I probably don't pronounce it right, but she was born in Hungary in 1925, and at the age of 19, in July 1944, Isaacson was deported to Auschwitz concentration camp and then to work as a forced laborer in Hesse-Schliebenau in an underground munitions plant. And she has written an autobiography, Seed of Sarah, and she describes that she constantly feared sexual violence. One day, she describes, a commandant of the Camp Lichtenau asked her to, a commander of the Camp Lichtenau asked her to follow him. And I quote now from her book. "The commandant strode ahead in his stiff breeches and pounding boots. Instinctively, I followed, my head cast down, my eyes on the graveled road. I had a flash of recognition, as if I had followed a past master in such dumb obedience. Do women inherit memories of rape? I recalled the myth of the Sabine women and the tale of Hunor and Magor and their abducted mates, the legendary ancestors of Hans and Matthias. My plight is not unique, I told myself. I am caught in an ancient rite of sex and war." Isaacson's knowledge of the antique myth of the Sabine women and the Hungarian tale of Hugo and Manor reflects the normalcy and the pervasiveness of sexual violence in armed conflict. It's everyday knowledge that sexual violence will happen. So women in particular were and are, in fact, still socialized with the notion to expect sexual violence. So to restrict their mobility in order to prevent being attacked, and in case they fall victim, to lay still and endure the act, or to kill themselves afterwards in order to prevent the shame. So these are things that were common in World War II. What is clearly described as a violent experience by women is, however, often not recognized as wrongdoing, let alone as crime, by men. In September 1944, for instance, in a quiet street in North London, 2 American GIs who were stationed during World War II in England, they raped 2 women. And afterwards, the women went to the police station and filed charges. When they were questioned, they recalled that their rapists asked them after the rape if they would want to go out to a dance with them on the following night. So these gendered experiences already point out one central challenge that we face when researching sexual violence in the past. There was, and in fact there is, no clear, unequivocal societal agreement that sexual violence is a crime. Now, of course, there are laws against sexual violence all over the world. However, the question is if and how they are used, and how do societies deal with perpetrators and with victims. So if we look at this, we will often find that there is no clear agreement that this form of violence is a crime. Let me explain further, and this is my first remark on the specificity of this form of violence. To date, it is often insinuated that rape victims are complicit in their own victimization. Unlike in cases of murder and theft, rape victims have to convince others that they have not invited or consciously or unconsciously desired the act. Gabi Zipfel, for instance, argues, and I quote, "A person beaten up in the street may not reckon with the empathy of those present. He or she may even be blamed for allegedly contributing to the violence through some form of provocation. You provoked me, so that's why I hit you. But he or she can assume that the experience of violently inflicted pain is unequivocally considered an unwanted and negative experience. Victims of sexual violence, in contrast, are often denied a clear assessment in this sense. This is because this kind of attack targets a body that is not only sensitive to pain, but also able to take pleasure. Sexual violence subjects the body of the victim to pain, and at the same time, it seizes its libidinal sensibility. So, end of quote. These implicit or explicit insinuation that the victim reacts ambiguously to a sexual attack arise because of the possibility of sexual arousal as a condition of the body. So the body can experience sexual arousal regardless of your will. Thus, a possible agreement between the perpetrator and the victim is implied. This is what we find when perpetrators say, she asked for it, she wanted it. So what is more, the victim is denied empathy and a clear classification of this form of violence as wrongdoing. Only when an act of sexual violence is accompanied by excessive brutality and, for instance, when the perpetrator kills the victim during or after the attack, this is then clearly perceived as an act that the victim did not want or unconsciously desire. Because now the perpetrator's sexuality, which is expressed in this act of violence, can be marginalized. It can be reduced to violence. So the discussion we, for instance, at the International Research Group for Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict lead right now is that it might be precisely this ambiguity of rape, which is directed against the body as a subject both to pain and to lust. It might be this ambiguity that makes this form of violence such an effective means of warfare. The alleged complicity of the victim suggests that the responsibility for the attack does not only lie with the perpetrator. On the contrary, it is suggested that the victim also contributed to her violation. So this in turn then can cause the victim's community to view the victim with suspicion, with distrust, and with contempt. And these negative responses in the community can also be attached to the men in the community, because they are the ones in the patriarchal order who allowed this to happen, who allowed the foreign men to rape these women. So as a result, the rape victims collective, the society, can be seriously torn apart and destroyed in the aftermath of sexual violence in wartime. And indeed, that sexual violence against women has devastating consequences and long-lasting consequences for an enemy society is known by military leaderships. And in fact, military leaderships expect sexual violence and they calculate with this during their campaigns. So this brings me to my second remark, the instrumentalization of the soldier's sexual desire by military leaderships. So World War II was predominantly fought by conscript armies. In addition, significant numbers of volunteers took up arms for a variety of reasons, for instance, patriotic duty. And the military faced the task of preparing all of these men who came from very different backgrounds, who were often very young, to face the most extreme experiences of human existence, the power to kill and the possibility to be killed. So part of the training of young men in state armies aims to unleash the individual's potential for violence in order to prepare the soldier for combat. At the same time, however, exactly this potential for violence has to be kept under control and to be channeled to military goals. Only certain forms of violence are supposed to be perpetrated. So the gray zone between individual actions and collective aims is a constant theme in military management. Ulrich Bröckling, a sociologist, has noted that military authorities, quote, must anticipate what eludes calculations. So in the words of one British colonel in 1917, I quote, "I have seen my own men commit atrocities and should expect to see it again. You cannot stimulate and let loose the animal in man and then expect to be able to cage it up again at a moment's notice." So in order to keep soldiers under control, they are subjected to a broad variety of disciplinary measures. So the military generally punishes aberrations more harshly than other institutions. Soldiers can be punished very harshly. At the same time, however, the military also promises to recompensate the individual for subordinating themselves to military leaders. So, as literary scholar Jan Philipp Riensma has argued, the order "you shall" is also accompanied by the license "you may." Soldiers are not only disciplined more rigorously than other people, they can also, at least during war, take more liberties. So one of the liberties that all army leaderships in World War II granted their men was sexual activity, including the perpetration of sexual violence. In the logic of military leaderships, the soldiers' sexual satisfaction appeared as a means of supplementing the men's responses to hardships of war, including their fear and the possibility of death. So to allow the soldiers the liberty of sexual violence was also a means to strengthen their masculinity and to foster cohesion and comradeship in the small units. What is more, military leaders were well aware of the devastating effects that sexual conquests of enemy women, including rape, had for the enemy society, as I said before, and largely they considered this as beneficial for military goals, in particular in phases of military advance into enemy territory. So in the short regulated time directly after conquest, this is, for instance, when the military leaderships usually tolerated sexual violence. Later on, during times of occupation, there will be certain regulations, there will be disciplinary measures, there will be punishment. But in the first days, this is largely tolerated. It's largely tolerated later too, but there's a difference. So at the same time, of course, sexual activity could also be a risk for military campaigns. And especially when army leaderships feared that they would lose control over their men. So military knowledge included an awareness of the potential effects of war brutality on men's sexuality. So, for example, the spread of sexually transmitted disease was also something that all armies of World War II feared because it had proven so deadly in World War I. The loss of discipline or the potential resistance in the occupied populations, these were also all seen as military risks. So in some cases, military leaderships took certain measures in order to tolerate, to condone, to cover up, to encourage, to discipline, or to punish acts of sexual violence. And which measures they actually took on the ground largely depended on the middle ranks and on their assessment of a particular situation. So the sources indicate that senior officers often not only turned a blind eye to sexual violence by subalterns, but that they actively covered it up, or even that they participated in acts of sexual violence. So in all military codes in all European nations, also in the US and in Russia, sexual violence or rape constituted a crime since early modern times. At the same time, it was largely condoned and only brought in front of a military court when it was explicitly regarded as harmful for military performance. So the perpetrators were usually tried to ensure military discipline or to ensure a smooth potential unrest in the occupied population. You can see this. Birgit Beck has researched on this on the German Wehrmacht. And she found that in France, the German Wehrmacht prosecuted blatant acts of rape with high sentences, comparably high sentences in occupied France. And on the other hand, only rarely tried cases at the Eastern Front. Of course, there's a different logic, because the Wehrmacht aimed to conquer the local populations at the Eastern Front, largely deemed as racially inferior in their logic. So they did not think that they depended so much on cooperation. So there's a real difference in the way the German military tried this. So ultimately, we can observe that all armies in World War II tried to make it look as if rape by their men was the crime of a few bad apples, or a specific group of outsiders. What is more, army leaderships frequently acted on the assumption that male sexuality could and should be incited to support military operations. A document from the Japanese Ministry of War distributed to all army units in 1940 explained, and I quote, "In particular, the psychological effects that the soldiers receive at comfort stations," so at the Japanese military brothels in which women and girls were largely forced into sexual enslavement. Comfort stations was a euphemism. In these comfort stations, the effects that the soldiers receive are most immediate and profound, and therefore it is believed that the enhancement of troop morale, of maintenance of discipline, and the prevention of crimes and venereal diseases are dependent on successful supervision of these comfort stations. End of quote. So remarkably, we can find similar ideas in very similar wording used in documents from the German Wehrmacht. So while the leadership regarded sexual satisfaction as positive with regard to the war effort and the spirit of the troops, they feared, on the other hand, that if too many cases of rape occurred, the loss of discipline, the lack of control, the resistance of the enemy population, and the spread of sexually transmitted disease. So in fact, like the Japanese army, the Wehrmacht also assumed that institutionalized sex in medically controlled brothels would provide a means of minimizing these risks. And in fact, the same assumptions also led American, British, and French troops to take over military as well as civilian brothels for their men in Asia, in North Africa, and in Europe. Ultimately, however, the contemporaries were well aware that military brothels were ineffective as a means of limiting the spread of sexually transmitted disease. But nonetheless, their establishment continued and the rhetoric of justification was sustained. So the establishment of these brothels by the German army, the Japanese army, and the Allied forces was very different. The scale was also different. I don't want to get into the details of this now, but the ideas were really quite similar. So this brings me to my third remark. So rape as a weapon of propaganda in relation to the local populations. Elizabeth Heinemann, historian, has argued, I quote, "Representations of sexual violence in war do not simply occur after the fact, Rather, they are part of the conflict itself. Sorry. So, when new means of mass communication appeared after during World War II, wartime rape was for the first time brought to the attention of a large international audience. So after the invasion of neutral Belgium by German army on its way to France in August and September 1914, for instance, the Allied media reported on what they described as a rape of Belgium. British, French, and Russian papers published remarkably graphic stories of brutal atrocities that the Germans allegedly perpetrated against the civilian population, in particular about the rape of women and the mutilation of children. The aim, however, was not to merely inform the public about the occurrence of crimes against women and children. Rather, the Allied propaganda appropriated the stories of rape victims in order to mobilize hatred against the brutal German barbarians. So it was to convince the people of the justness of the war cause and to enlist their active support. But this condemnation of sexual violence and political rhetoric, which we can find on all fronts in World War II, this does not mean that the stories of the victims were heard. As historian Ruth Harris has observed, and I quote, "Men's anxieties and fantasies, much more than the tragedy of women's experiences, shape the discussion of sexual violation in war." Indeed, one might argue that this exploitation of rape for a certain political cause would not have been possible if there had been more interest in really dealing with the experience of the victims. Because, of course, these experiences were multifaceted and for instance, the sources indicate that the actual experience of women and girls would have revealed a much more ambivalent and complicated story about the constellations, that not only the German perpetrated sexual violence, but also that they also experienced other sexual violence and so on. Yes, so such knowledge, however, was not speakable at this time. So this brings me to my fourth remark. I have five altogether. So the fourth remark goes on speakability and unspeakability. So while perpetrators of sexual violence might have routinely bragged about their sexual conquest in a circle of comrades, they were generally reluctant to admit their behavior to outsiders. For one thing, soldiers felt that civilians were outsiders who could not understand what they had been through and why they had acted in the way they did. So in addition, the men anticipated that the revelation of their brutal experiences and criminal deeds would fundamentally alter living together with their civilian contacts, so with wives and children after revealing the story. So most soldiers assigned their stories, in fact, to oblivion or kept them among themselves in veterans associations. A number of soldiers did confide in doctors or priests. This is sometimes in records of doctors or priests, is sometimes where we can find sources where men also speak. In addition, memoirs and literary texts offer some insights into the way that sexual violence was dealt with. For example, some Japanese soldiers mentioned their visits to comfort stations in Asia rather freely because they did not consider this to be violence. So in some situations, men publicly admit their violent acts after the end of the war in order to express their regrets and to politicize the brutalization of young men in times of war. This is also possible. But these men were, and still are, often faced with the accusation that they were traitors. For instance, one of the Japanese commanders, Yoshio Suzuki, he testified at a self-organized women's tribunal against Japan's military sexual slavery, which took place in Tokyo in 2000. So he testified, he described how during a military operation in China, he had given his men to do whatever they wanted and then himself raped a woman. So actually, in front of the building, Japanese nationalists demonstrated, calling him a liar, and threatened him for besmirching the honor of the Japanese forces. So there are sometimes few men who actually make this a subject, but they can also get in political troubles. So it is this social, cultural, and political framework between silencing, between mudslinging and exploitation in which victims remain silent or sometimes speak about their experiences of sexual violence. So I think we must think about this silence not only as I didn't want to talk about it, but the victims are not authorized to talk about this. So for many victims it was really impossible to speak. Many were murdered, others committed suicide, again others were confronted with denial and mistrust when their social environment insinuated that through their behavior they were complicit in the crime. So the fact that sexual violence was merely one of many physical and psychic assaults women had to endure was another reason for remaining silent. For example, in the case of female survivors of the Holocaust, who considered their violent experiences as their experiences of sexual violence as marginal, sometimes in relation to murder and extermination. So women might also have kept silent after the end of the war. This is an argument by historian Zoe Waxman, in order to spare their menfolk the additional pain of having been unable to protect them. So in the rare instances that women were in the position to come forward to police or military authorities, or if the crime was reported by witnesses or confidants, the victims had to go through humiliating police and military interrogations, and sometimes through painful genital examinations. If a case came in front of the court, the victim also found herself in a difficult position because her respectability was questioned, similar to peacetime inquiries in which women's sexual histories and motives for speaking out could become a matter of extensive interrogation. When female rape victims were asked to contribute to reports on enemy crimes, they appear to have received as a much more sympathetic hearing. For example, the West German Federal Ministry for Expellees documented Polish and Soviet crimes against German expellees after World War II, Vertriebene. And in these cases, the accounts of women of rape were readily believed. In the later published report, it became clear that the testimonies were used and embellished in the interests of Cold War propaganda. So there can be certain political constellations in which the testimonies of victims become important. We can still ask, then, are the women really listened to, or in how do we understand this narrative of Cold War propaganda? And we can also ask the testimonies of the women, question the testimonies of the women themselves, because of course they are also part of this political constellation and are not free from the thoughts of the Cold War. So an opportunity for women and girls to speak about sexual violence could arise when they were among themselves in a female community and sexual violence became a shared experience. In Berlin 1945, for instance, the absence of most German menfolk who had been in the military and who had either died or fled or was in prison of war camps, this absence created a space in which women seem to have had the possibility to exchange experiences and prevention strategies more or less openly. So according to historian Atina Grossman, especially in bigger German cities like Berlin, the sexual reform movement of the 1920s and 1930s had meant that the new woman had the possibility to develop a more resolute stance toward sexuality. And as a result, women who had already been adults in the 1920s were able to deal with their violation rather pragmatically. So in diaries and letters, women recorded how their apprehensions about rape were realized when the Red Army soldiers arrived. They expected the Red Army soldiers to rape. For some, rape by Soviet soldiers affirmed their racist ideas about the Soviets as Untermenschen, as subhuman. So they said, well, they are uncivilized. Of course, there will be rape. For other women, the men acted out of revenge for the crimes that their brothers, their fiancés, or husbands and sons had previously committed in Poland and the Soviet Union. So this is a specific historical constellation in which women were able to speak about sexual violence. After the German men returned, however, all of these stories disappeared. When at that time, rape became a powerful metaphor of defeat in the West German memory, and then it appeared in a certain way as desexualized. Suddenly it was the Germans who had become victims of rape by Soviet soldiers, women and men alike. This was not anymore about a gendered crime. In East Germany, in contrast, the persistence of sexual violence by Soviet soldiers until the 1950s was actively erased from political debate and collective memory. So the example, to make one last point, the example of the Red Army furthermore reveals that dealing with sexual violence can be a particular complex and painful process when the perpetrator is not the enemy. For example, female prisoners in Auschwitz had awaited Soviet soldiers as liberators, and they were devastated when some of them did become victims of rape. So this also happened. For them, this experience of sexual violence was the ultimate destruction of their belief in humanity. And it has been very difficult to research this and to find ways how to deal with this. So there's another strand about what happened since the 1970s. In the 1970s, sexual violence started to emerge as a subject of feminist inquiry and later of academic scholarship, in particular in the United States, but also in other regions of the world. So, for instance, this also led to the fact that researchers and activists started to actually approach women and to ask them about their experiences, but also only from my experiences in certain constellations. So in Germany, for instance, we don't find these interviews. German feminist researchers have not asked for instance, concentration camp survivors about sexual violence. On the contrary, in Asia, we do find these interviews in South Korea and Japan and other Asian countries, the research on the so-called comfort station system for the Japanese army. This was fueled and accompanied and started actually by a strong, visible social movement that clearly supported women's claims for justice and for reparation. In this atmosphere, survivors could make sense of their past as a collective experience, as a shared experience, and they were enabled to speak of rape and sexual enslavement rather openly. So today we have testimonies by more than 500 victims of the Comfort Women system, and from many different countries, and almost 200 women also decided to go public with their face and to show their photo in their portrait photo in the Women's Active Museum on War and Peace in Tokyo. So in contrast to that, I get to my fifth remark. It becomes clear, I think, that the meaning of women's narratives on sexual violence also lies in silences and contradictions. And this, the question, why is that, has also something to do with the question exploring the gray zones. So it is not always unequivocally clear if a sexual encounter is consensual or non-consensual, if it is violent or non-violent, if it is commercial or non-commercial. For example, sexual barter, when women decided to agree to sex in exchange for food or protection. You can, of course, say she decided to do this. At the same time, you must also concede that she was forced to, so we can also speak about sexual violence. So this is one of these gray areas where it's actually a question of positionalities and fluid. How do we describe the agency of the women and still understand their victimhood? So what becomes clear is that we need to explore these gray zones when we explore the sources. Let me give you an example. In 1999, filmmaker Hartmut Kaminski conducted an interview with the former Wehrmacht soldier Otto Pauls. When asked about rape during the military campaign in the Ukraine, Pauls replied that violence was not necessary. Quote, "They were always the same men, soldiers and officers in every new village they had bribed. Today people talk about it as if the soldiers had behaved swinish and raped them. But I have never heard anything like that. We did not need to. The Ukraine welcomed us with open arms. Only we did not thank them." So overall, Otto Pauls' account is rather critical about the German past and the crimes of the Wehrmacht in the Soviet Union. Still, he describes sexual contacts with local women merely as harmless consensual contacts. What happened beside or even despite the war. Overall, his account is quite typical. Many former soldiers relate that enemy women had looked up and were to the German soldier and were more than willing to have sex with them. And in fact, this story was sometimes backed up by local men who accused their wives and daughters of horizontal collaboration. So now we know from the historical sources that indeed in the Ukraine, directly after the invasion of the German army, part of the population welcomed the German army as liberators from the Soviet troops, and that in this context, some women were indeed attracted to the foreign men in uniform. Despite this, however, it would be premature to assume that Otto Pauls' depiction reflects the historical reality. For one thing, there was, of course, a huge power imbalance between the male occupiers and local women and girls. So we thus must ask how the behavior of women and girls was shaped by their needs, by their fears, by their rationalities in the war situations. What were the structural forces that shaped their action? And if a woman decided to get involved with a German soldier, she risked political consequences. That is, she risked to be accused of collaboration or simply of being sexually loose. So what is more, some of the women appear to have been very young. So I want to show you it. I didn't manage to put this up there, so I'll show you here, and I can give it around. I want to show you a picture from the photo album of Willy Rose from the Ukraine in 1941. So you see a German soldier and younger girls. You can just and you see that the German soldier is much older than the girls. In a certain thing, I think a picture like this reveals something that written sources cannot. In this case, it reveals the girls' situation. They are trying to test out their womanhood to impress the older German soldier, but also their insecurity. And it also reveals the soldier's enjoyment, who clearly plays with the young women. In this form of playing with the younger women, if this ended in sexual intercourse, of course I don't know if this is what happened in the picture, but if something like this did, I would argue that we must understand it also as a situation of sexual overpowering, even if the women did not resist or even if they actively consented, because it's such a huge power imbalance. A man like him, like this German soldier, knew that he would leave the village and go to another village shortly. But the women, they were bound to stay in their social context and to live with the consequences. The men knew that this was likely to have serious consequences for the women and girls, and they did not care. So besides sexual violence in these gray zones, it took the Ukrainian population, including women and girls, only a few weeks or even days to realize that the Germans were pursuing brutal policies that were not beneficial to the local populations. So while some women might have felt curiosity at the beginning, this could also very quickly subside. Otto Paul's narrative does thus not document the historical reality. It much rather reveals typical male fantasies of conquest, that the idea that the territory, the conquest of a territory, is an act of the conquest of the body and the mind of the women in that territory. So, I conclude very quickly. What becomes clear is that sexual violence is not an easy subject to research. So the traditional methodological toolkit of the historian is inadequate when it comes to examining sexual encounters during World War II, during the Holocaust, during the occupation, and during the aftermath. To find, to interpret, and to represent sources, all of this poses a challenge. Researchers who work with the material have, on the one hand, to be able to read between the lines. They have to be able to identify the blind spots, the hints, the gaps, the silences in the historical records. On the other hand, they are not only silences, but also generalizations and exaggerations. Propaganda, for instance, but also other forms of exaggerations. So the historian must also be able to interrogate the meanings of stereotypical narratives and of myth. So in order to understand how representations of sexual violence in the public realm are related to what actually happened on the ground, what happened to whom and by whom, in order to research this, it is necessary, I think, to ask who speaks about sexual violence and what is spoken about at what point of time, what becomes visible at what point of time. And this includes, of course, the reverse question: who does not speak about sexual violence and what is not spoken about and what is silenced? And thirdly, I think we have to always try to investigate what assumptions and interests about gender, about sexuality and violence underlie the speaking and the silence. So today it becomes more and more apparent that certain constellations of sexual violence come into view at particular times, others remain obliterated. When and how this form of violence enters public discourse, or when and how it remains unexpressed, this depends on geopolitical interests, on cultural assumptions, on socio-political developments, and what I want to call on the communicative rules of sexual violence. On the one hand, this form of violence is made visible and scandalized, politicized as a crime when it can clearly be regarded as a crime of the enemy, of the other, often depicted as the uncivilized other. On the other hand, and at the same time, the behavior of one's own soldiers, this is trivialized and largely silenced. So in both cases, either the exaggeration, the clear politicization, or the silencing, in both cases, the victims are not authorized to relate their experiences. So to understand these kind of logics, which I think we can observe everywhere, and to understand the pervasiveness of sexual violence in general, and at the same time the specificities in different regions and different constellations and dynamics, to understand all of this and to paint a more complicated picture than it often seems, we must avoid to follow such instrumentalizations of the subject. In order to actually understand what happened, we have to, I think, closely describe what are the ideas and the conditions of gender and sexuality, and who does what to whom in which situations.
Thank you, Elena, so much for this really wonderful lecture. We couldn't wish for anything better. We have now something like 20 minutes for Q&A. And I will moderate it. I forgot, and I apologize, to mention that the research group Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict has a wonderful website. It is a really useful resource with the link, because this one does not really work, so I will tell you, but it's a short address, waringgender.net, and you will also find there a bibliography. So.
Yes, I have also brought some leaflets. I think maybe not enough for everyone, but you can have a look.
I will pass them on. And while I pass them on, you can think about questions.
So this is on the bibliography.
Vanessa goes first.
Thank you very much. I just recently came from one workshop for MA PhD students, and our concluding remarks were connected with activism and being historian of research. And I think what you mentioned about the research group is to put together also NGOs and activists and so on. So I would like to ask you about the suggestion how we can actually make the historians more useful for society, and not to be just the ones hidden behind their computers and in their archives writing articles read by 20 people, if I'm positive. And I have a second question, if I may. And it's about Korea and about North Korea. To which extent it's somehow discussed there, or if it's completely silenced, the issue of the conflict. Thank you.
So the first question I can answer more easily, I think. The second question about North Korea. So I'll start with that. Or do you want to take more questions?
Yeah.
So I mentioned that the Asian Women's Group organized an international tribunal, so a symbolic tribunal against military sexual slavery by the Japanese army in 2000. And at the time, North Korea also attended So there were North Korean women survivors, and also lawyers who were actually also bringing forward their case. And it turned out that actually the women had received, women could receive, it was not, or it turned out that it was not really discussed as an active subject in society, as far as I understood. But women could receive a small pension as war victims very soon after the war, because in these political constellations they were perceived as enemies, as victims of the Japanese imperial enemy. So the constellation was very clear, and in this context women did have the possibility to receive, for instance, a pension. And today there are actually films, about 2 films I think, about women in North Korea, and there are some victims who talk about it, but in a very stereotypical narrative, I think. So the question is, I don't know enough about North Korea, but the question would be, what is behind that? How is this, how the vocabulary they use seems to be very much framed or coined by ideological ideas. So to decode this, I don't know. I cannot do this. About the activism, how historians can be more useful, I don't know. I think in a certain sense I like to think about researchers on this subject, or no, the other way around. I like to think about activists also as researchers. I think there's often the idea that activists are only in their everyday business, but they have a huge knowledge. So we need to find ways to make this knowledge known, also first to us, and then also to a more general, to the academic, but also to the society. So I think one thing that the historian can practically do is, for instance, make interviews with activists and really find out what they have to say and think about what to do with it. Sometimes it's very useful to publish an interview or to invite activists for discussions, because of course they have a huge amount of very detailed knowledge that otherwise just often in the everyday business where they are always stressed out goes into oblivion. So this is, I think, one thing. The other thing is that I like to think about myself also as an activist, and this is how I actually started the project. I went to Korea in 1994 in order to be demonstrating in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. So I think the question is also, how do you approach the women? How do you approach the political setting? I think there are good possibilities also to position yourself, if you position yourself clearly, to make clear that this is also necessary, that this is also about, in the society, of course, it's a very disputed subject often. So in order to take a clear stance, it is often necessary to be also have an activist view.
First of all, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. It was great. And the second of all, the questions, I would be interested in the interdisciplinary group you mentioned that you're part of and that you meet once a year and address various questions and issues. I would be interested whether the issue of children born of rape as also victims of sexual violence has already been raised, and also on the issue of men as victims of sexual violence.
The question of children is one that does play a role in many for many of the people present in this research group, including my own research. So it has been raised, but it has not been a central subject in our discussion. But the question is, what are we talking about when we are talking about children? You can talk about this on many levels. You can talk about the question on how do the authorities deal with this historically? What does it mean for the women who have these children? But you can also talk about the situation of the children in later life. How are they, as I'm sure as you know much better, so how are the children, how do they live after 1945, for example? So, and for this latter question, I think there is actually a quite active research group in Germany. I don't know if you know it. It's by Stelz and Marx and others. So they are discussing these questions. So I think there is a lot of research, more and more research, also comparative from different areas, from the Vietnam War and so on. So similar question. It's not so much in the focus in our debate, but it does play a role. So it's different with sexual violence against men. This plays a big role in our discussion. Because it came up as a subject, and since it came up as a couple years ago, maybe 10 years ago, it was very vividly put into the discussion. So we finally, the last myth falls, we now have to talk about sexual violence against men. So my first counter argument is, it's not that the last myth falls. Already in the 1970s, for instance, Susan Brownlander, in her book Against Our Will, from 1975, she already mentioned sexual violence against men and boys. It's not her central subject, but she mentions it. So I think there is a certain problem that feminists are now accused that they have made this a subject against women, which is not true in that sense. But of course, the focus has been on sexual violence against women. So now what happens is, what happens in the last 10 years is that many people say, okay, so sexual violence is in that sense not even a gender crime, because women become victims of it, but men also. So I would strongly oppose to that and say we really have to ask, we don't know much about it. We really have to ask very closely what actually happens. And we have to ask, do men who are sexually violated actually make the same experiences as women who are sexually violated? I would say no. Of course they can experience sexual violence, but it does have a different meaning. It does have in their whole socialization, individually and on the collective level. And one more point I wanted to say about this, it does have a different meaning. Now I forget my point. I say another point. One thing that, for instance, Aaron Belkin has researched is sexual violence, and this has become a subject, is sexual violence within the military. And his topic is rape of men within the US military. And he says he was very surprised when, after a lecture on sexuality and violence in the military, afterwards a recruit came up to him, and today, like maybe 15 years ago, a recruit came up to him and said, men rape each other all the time. And then he started to research on this as an initiation rite in the army. So as something that, for instance, men do against other men so that they learn to endure. But it does not have the same meaning as sexual violence against women. And also, one last point, now I remember, is that recently in the debate, now it is said, well, women also perpetrate sexual violence. So this is now a huge subject, that women are also perpetrators. Yes, of course, we know cases. For instance, in the concentration camps, something that Elissa Mailänder has also started to explore, in the concentration camps where women guards, female guards, tortured prisoners in such a way that you might think about this as sexual violence. So, but is this really the same thing as when men perpetrate sexual violence? Or how do we actually understand this? How do we describe it? And I don't want to give the answer. I don't want to say it's not. But I want to say, before we make any assumptions about this, we really just need to ask questions. And right now, I think many assumptions came out. It's just the same, so it's not a gender crime. But this doesn't help us. This doesn't help us to understand the phenomenon.
If I just may plug in, Regina is contributing to my special issue of German history and sexuality in the Holocaust, and Dorota Glowacka will have there an article about male sexual violence in the Holocaust. Thomas Carey, who is a philosopher and has just joined Edinburgh, has a forthcoming piece on the same topic. And I can give you the Anna.
Yeah, I have the question regarding how do you deal with the cultural differences between you as a researcher and the people or the victims that you are researching, because I guess that not only there can be a difference between how different cultures talk about sexuality and sexual violence, but also that maybe something that we as contemporary Western society perceive as sexual violence must not necessarily be seen as a sexual violence in different community and vice versa. So how do you deal with that, and how does it influence the outcome of your research if you tend to write more from the point of view what you see as a sexual violence, or if you reflect what also the victims themselves see as sexual violence?
The easy answer is, or the short answer is, I think as a researcher, I'd always try to make clear my own positionality. So I try to say where I come from, and I try to say, okay, I am using whatever the definition of the International Criminal Court, and that regards as sexual violence the following 10 things. And now I'm using this definition to look at the historical actors, and of course I cannot really say what they regarded as sexual violence and not. So to make clear this ambivalence and this difference. But let me give you an example. So in the Russell Tribunal, so this was also in this kind of a self-organized, not an official, but a symbolic tribunal after the Vietnam War. We find descriptions, testimony of men who describe how electroshock was given to their testicles. Of course, when this happened in the 1970s, nobody saw us as sexual violence. But from today's point of view, we will think, this is sexual violence. So this clearly marks that you look at a situation from a different point of view. So I think you kind of have to make clear where you're coming from, and have to ask what role this plays. So for instance, when looking at World War II, I sometimes also ask this question: did the victims actually consider this as sexual violence. And I think I usually decide to include things when I think that they must have had, because they have happened often and they must have had an impact on the sexual practices or the sexual humiliation and so on of the victim, regardless of whether they thought this was sexual violence. But if they talk about it in a way that it becomes clear that this was a form of humiliation that was more than just humiliation, but that had a sexual component, then, for instance, I integrate it. But you always, I think, have to make clear what you're talking about. And on the cultural difference, I think, really, of course, this is a subject, but you can be very surprised. It's not that the Western view, with all its I don't know, academic ideas about what we're talking about with all this differentiation, comes to other cultures and just, I don't know, puts their view onto them. My experience is that much on the contrary, often the women in Korea, for example, they are much more clear what they want to say to me. And even if in Korea the word rape did not exist at the time and they did not have this language and so on and so on, they have a clear stance of what was done wrong to them and that it influenced their whole lives and their whole sexual lives. And for instance, that they were not able to marry, that they were not women with a respectable sexuality, and so on and so on. So even if they did not have the word rape, they have all of this. And of course, as a researcher, you have, I think, you should be careful, try not to use, in that sense, your own vocabularies, but to ask them, so what happened, and to listen to what they tell you. And they will, I mean, I think they will actually tell you some things. So I think our duty as researchers is to ask open questions, but to really listen what they have to say, and not to listen, not to hear only what we think, but to try to keep an open mind. Of course you cannot. Of course you always have your own framework, but to try to keep an open mind as much as possible, to really listen to the details.
I'm researching the peace and security agenda myself in current context. So I was wondering, I have a question which is a little bit related to how do you work with activists, or where do you work with activists? Do you somehow try to connect in your research to the present day and even the policy level in Germany, for example? Even on the policy level, do you work with the government, cooperate, discuss things like action plan on peace and security?
If you talk about the international research group, then the members each decide on their own. They have own views on that, they have their own contacts, their own projects. For instance, there is a big research project called the Gender of Justice at the University of Goldsmith in London, which deals with question of sexual violence in the former Yugoslavia and how this was treated in the courts ever since the end of the war, or at the end of the war. And they, in a certain sense, do a judicial analysis, a historical analysis, a philosophical analysis, and they do also work with the question, what does this mean for the women, peace and security agenda, and what does it mean for current policies and so on. So, and we do have these discussions in our research groups. Of course, we discuss certain UN politics, we discuss certain policies. and at certain points in time, of course, it is important to try to take the results, for instance, of historical research or scientific research and try to get into contact with the politicians working on that, or with the policymakers working on that, in order to give them kind of also an idea of what are the things that can actually happen on different levels and to complicate the picture. So, in fact, as you know, Germany is right now the co-head of for 1919 and 1920, the co-head of the Women, Peace and Security Working Group in the UN. So, of course, now there will be more events in the next 2 years, and we will try also to visit them and to see what is happening there. So I think this is very important. But this said, I say this, but then I would think it is also, you have to be very careful, because you don't want your research to be influenced or hijacked by a political agenda from today, by a certain political constellation, discussions about certain ideas. So if I would use this for my research, then this would be very problematic. So I'm very hesitant, for instance, to work directly together in the historical research with policy making, because I think, for instance, also to take the money from the policy, to finance from the policy making, of course, it does make sense. It can also lead to good cooperations, but it's also very problematic not to get into this framework and serve certain political interests.
If there are no more questions, and I'm giving you a meaningful look.
Yeah, I wonder.
Wait.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking before this question of this Yugoslavian war was brought up. Actually, in that case, there is this rape as kind of form of ethnic domination and conquer. Is there anything? I mean, is any rape during the Second World War similar to this kind of rape as ethnic domination and conquer as we've seen it in Yugoslavia, in Bosnia? Was there anything similar anywhere in the context of the Second World War?
This is it's a very good question, but very complicated question, I think, because we first have to clarify what we mean by ethnic domination rape during the Yugoslav war, because I think actually it is not so clear. So we have in our head this idea, this clear idea that this was ethnic rape, that it was committed against women of the enemy. Yes, but when you listen to women from Yugoslavia, to victims and also to activists, you will often find that it is not so clear, that of course there were certain rapes in camps and so on which can be clarified as ethnic rapes, but they are also take place in the whole, often neighbors or often people who knew each other personally or not really personally. So this is also a question of the gendered framework. So of course you cannot understand one without the other and have to take a very close look. And I think this is comparable. You can also take a close look, for instance, at the German army and how the German army behaved in the eastern territories. I wouldn't say the German army, I mean, it is often said that for instance, that Serb forces were ordered to rape. But until today, we have not seen one proof of this, that this actually happened. What happened is that, for instance, a commander says something like, go and conquer this. Everything you find is yours. So, and that the men then assume that they have a license to rape, that they are allowed to rape. And this is also what we find in parts, not all the time, but in certain situations, in certain parts with the German Wehrmacht in the at the Eastern Front. There were no official orders to rape, of course. Not of course, but there were not that we know of at least. And of course, the Nazi racial ideology explicitly opposed sexual contacts with women from so-called inferior women. But they also said, go and conquer this, go and occupy this, and this was understood as a license to rape, and this was tolerated in certain cases. And of course then comes the important question, why do the men think that they are allowed to rape if nobody orders them in that sense? And this is the important question. I think this is what we need to really deal with, because this brings us back to the gender relations, to the gender ideas about sexuality and violence, which are at work already in the pre-war societies. This is nothing that comes out of the blue in the exceptional situation of war, but this is something that is a continuation, and we have to really explore this to know more about it.
Please join me in thanking Regina Mühlhäuser. I think we all deserve a good cup of tea or coffee. And then in half an hour we will continue with the workshop and the study of sources for those who are workshop participants. And Diana will lead us to hot beverages.